Picture warm, gooey cookies, crunchy candies, velvety cakes, waffle cones piled high with ice cream. Is your mouth watering? Are you craving dessert? Why? What happens in the brain that makes sugary foods so hard to resist? Sugar is a general term used to describe a class of molecules called carbohydrates, and it's found in a wide variety of food and drink. Just check the labels on sweet products you buy. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, maltose, lactose, dextrose, and starch are all forms of sugar. So are high fructose corn syrup, fruit juice, raw sugar, and honey. And sugar isn't just in candies and desserts. It's also added to tomato sauce, yogurt, dried fruit, flavored waters, or granola bars. Since sugar is everywhere, it's important to understand how it affects the brain. What happens when sugar hits your tongue? And does eating a little bit of sugar make you crave more? You take a bite of cereal. The sugars it contains activate the sweet taste receptors, part of the taste buds on the tongue. These receptors send a signal up to the brainstem, and from there it forks off into many areas of the forebrain, one of which is the cerebral cortex. Different sections of the cerebral cortex process different tastes: bitter, salty, umami, and in our case, sweet. From here, the signal activates the brain's reward system. This reward system is a series of electrical and chemical pathways across several different regions of the brain. It's a complicated network, but it helps answer a single subconscious question. Should I do that again? That warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you taste Grandma's chocolate cake? That's your reward system saying, yes. And it's not just activated by food. Socializing, sexual behavior, and drugs are just a few examples of things and experiences that also activate the reward system. But overactivating this reward system kickstarts a series of unfortunate events: loss of control, craving, and increased tolerance to sugar. Let's get back to our bite of cereal. It travels down into your stomach and eventually into your gut. And guess what? There are sugar receptors here too. They're not taste buds, but they do send signals telling your brain that you're full, or that your body should produce more insulin to deal with the extra sugar you're eating. The major currency of our reward system is dopamine, an important chemical or neurotransmitter. There are many dopamine receptors in the forebrain, but they're not evenly distributed. Certain areas contain dense clusters of receptors, and these dopamine hotspots are a part of our reward system. Drugs like alcohol, nicotine, or heroin send dopamine into overdrive, leading some people to constantly seek that high. In other words, to be addicted. Sugar also causes dopamine to be released, though not as violently as drugs. And sugar is rare among dopamine-inducing foods. Broccoli, for example, has no effect, which probably explains why it's so hard to get kids to eat their veggies. Speaking of healthy foods, let's say you're hungry and decide to eat a balanced meal. You do, and dopamine levels spike in the reward system hotspots. But if you eat that same dish many days in a row, dopamine levels will spike less and less, eventually leveling out. That's because when it comes to food, the brain evolved to pay special attention to new or different tastes. Why? 2 reasons. First, to detect food that's gone bad. And second, because the more variety we have in our diet, the more likely we are to get all the nutrients we need. To keep that variety up, we need to be able to recognize a new food, and more importantly, we need to want to keep eating new foods. And that's why the dopamine levels off when a food becomes boring. Now back to that meal. What happens if in place of the healthy, balanced dish, you eat sugar-rich food instead? If you rarely eat sugar, or don't eat much at a time, the effect is similar to that of the balanced meal. But if you eat too much, the dopamine response does not level out. In other words, eating lots of sugar will continue to feel rewarding. In this way, sugar behaves a little bit like a drug. It's one reason people seem to be hooked on sugary foods. So think back to all those different kinds of sugar. Each one is unique, but every time any sugar is consumed, it kickstarts a domino effect in the brain that sparks a rewarding feeling. Too much too often, and things can go into overdrive. So yes, overconsumption of sugar can have addictive effects on the brain. But a wedge of cake once in a while won't hurt you.
Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Now, here's your host, James Maskell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks so much for the rapturous applause. I always thought we deserved this kind of applause. New York, you're being trumped by the great audience here in Orange County, California. Look, the truth is, I'm going to have to be honest with you all here. There is no audience. And the reason is because I slightly messed up the time. We do the show at 8 p.m. Eastern in New York, and I thought, okay, we could just do the same thing. For those of you who have been in New York, you know that we use Neue House, and there's a Neue House in LA. So I thought we'll just do it in LA. Now, unfortunately, what I didn't take into account is the fact that it's not as easy to get a bunch of doctors somewhere in LA with all the traffic at 5 o'clock on a Monday. And so we are very thankful to Dr. Pedram Shoje and Well.org for having us here at his beautiful set for his upcoming book, Urban Monk. And you'll be able to see Pedram later. If you have a question for him, we can tell you how you can get in touch. But yeah, welcome to the first Functional Forum of 2016. And we are here in Orange County, California. And I just want to give a first shout out to all of the meetups that are watching here today. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are watching from all over the world who are watching by themselves. But there's something really powerful when people get together into community to watch the show as a group. And what we're hearing is that people are getting a ton of value from these communities, and these communities are growing very, very quickly. New communities since last year, Cape Town, South Africa, Manila in the Philippines, and lots more across the USA. And we have a new thing that I want to share with all of you is our new Functional Forum meetup site. So if you go to meetup.functionalforum.com, you can sign up to host your own meetup, and we've made it completely seamless for you. You don't have to make your own Eventbrite. You don't have to do anything. You just have to go on there and get set up. You'll be in touch with our team, and we want to make it so easy for you. And guess what? There are so many benefits to becoming a meetup host. If you want to grow your business, if you sell something to practitioners, if you're a sales rep, or a supplement company, or a lab company, it's a great situation. If you're a practitioner looking to build your practice, wouldn't you want to meet everyone in your zip code who could actually send you referrals? And also, there's benefits of growth. There's benefits of being part of the movement as well. And this ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network that we are looking to develop. And it all revolves around you and you doing it. And it only takes initiative. It takes a little bit to initiative, but the only reason we say you can't give initiative, you can only take initiative, and that's because it's there for you to do. So go to meetup.functionalforum.com, start a meetup, find another practitioner. We have meetups as small as 2 people, as many as 50 or 100 in certain places around the world and places around America. We've made it super easy for you to have a successful meetup with our new site. Go and check it out. Now, normally at the beginning of the Functional Forum, I like to do a little bit of a banter, what's going on in the news. But if you've been following our emails since the last time, you'll know that we've started a new podcast called the Evolution of Medicine News Videocast, where each week my partner Gabe Hoffman and I look at topics relevant to the modern practitioner, things that you should know, and just trying to wrap up the news in 15 minutes. So stay tuned to your emails and also to our YouTube channel for that. And you can also find it on Facebook. So I'm going to rely on you watching at home tonight to send all of the questions, because we don't have much of a studio audience here. For the first time, I don't have a studio audience. I'm feeling a little naked, but it's good to be here with all of you. So we need questions from all of you at home. So if you're using Twitter, you can use #FunctionalForum. I'll be monitoring it on my phone, and I'll ask the questions later to the panel. And we have an unbelievable show here tonight. We have some people that I've wanted to get onto the Functional Forum for a long time. And also I wanted to start 2016 with the spirit of gratitude, because there are some people who are speaking tonight who have made a big impact already on the evolution of medicine and are doing great work. So we're going to feature them. So we're going to talk tonight about functional neuropsychiatry. And this has been such a huge topic throughout the last year, and we did a brain forum back in October 2014, but a lot has happened since then. So last year you saw from the UCLA newsroom, memory loss associated with Alzheimer's reversed for the first time. So this was a small trial in UCLA, but then using a systems approach to memory disorders, they were able to reverse Alzheimer's in a small study. And then we saw this was in the beginning and the middle of the year, out of the University of Virginia. They say anatomy and other medicine books will have to be rewritten in order to take account of a major new discovery that could significantly influence therapies for various neurological diseases, including Alzheimer's, autism, multiple sclerosis, and others. And we're going to talk a lot about that this evening. And they said, in a stunning discovery that overturns decades of textbook teaching, researchers at the University of Virginia have determined that the brain is directly connected to the immune system by vessels previously thought not to exist. And this is not news to the functional medicine practitioner community. This is systems biology, root cause resolution medicine, and so the fact that it's getting out to more people is very exciting. And then just recently, a featured blog from Robert Whitaker, who wrote Mad in America, he says he was reporting that in the conventional narrative of psychiatry's history, Thorazine, which is remembered today as the first antipsychotic, is said to have kicked off a pharmacological revolution or psychopharmacological revolution when it arrived in asylum medicine in 1954. Thorazine initiated this revolution comparable to the introduction of penicillin in general medicine, and soon psychiatry was touting it, and now if you look at a big enough study and they look at the functional outcomes, the evidence base is crashing down. So what are we going to do about this? What can we actually do? Where are some good starting points? So we have some great speakers tonight. We're going to welcome a little bit later Dr. Datis Karazian. I've wanted to have him on the forum for a long time. He's certainly a fan favorite. Dr. Hyla Cass. But first of all, I just wanted to introduce, someone who has been a great friend of the evolution of medicine. He's a passionate educator and a good friend. Please welcome to the Functional Forum for the second time, Dr. Tom O'Brien. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, Tom, you inspired a lot of the evolution of medicine and functional forum. Your gluten summit a few years ago was the first one to really sort of break through into the mainstream and get over 100,000 people interested in a particular topic. 2 years later, is it all still about gluten?
No, it's not. Gluten is a component, but it's not the primary thing. The reason that we talked about gluten and why I still do include gluten is because it's a primary trigger. The bottom line, as you're going to hear tonight, is all about inflammation. And inflammation in the brain and some of the mechanisms that might be causing that. And gluten, if you have a sensitivity to gluten, or actually it's an adverse reaction to foods, any food that you may have a sensitivity to could impact on inflammation in the brain. That's the bottom line. And there's just over 20,000 studies on gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. And the most common system of the body that's impacted is the brain. For every single person that has GI symptoms with the sensitivity to gluten, there are 8 that don't, that the symptoms are somewhere else in the body. And the most common system of the body is the brain.
I know there's been some new science talking about that mechanism, what's actually happening. And I thought when you told me this last year, I just thought this was super fascinating and need to be on the Functional Forum.
Yes, yes. And before I say that, I just want to give credit to Dr. Michael Gershon, I believe is from Princeton, who in 1999 published the book, The Second Brain. And that opened up the world to many of us that there really was something more than just this brain that was controlling how we function. And the things that he said back in 1999 have proven to be so true and accurate. I actually think that our gut is not the second brain. I think it's the first brain in terms of its impact. But a study came out recently that just rocked my world, and I've talked about it a lot since then. And with neurodegenerative diseases, specifically Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, what they know, of course, is that it's these misfolded proteins, that if it's Parkinson's, it's alpha-synuclein that gets misfolded, and if it's Alzheimer's, it's beta-amyloid that will get misfolded. And these misfolded proteins have an attraction to certain areas of the brain, almost like a magnet. Alpha-synuclein will go into the substantia nigra, and eventually cause Parkinson's. The inflammation will damage the tissue and cause Parkinson's. What they've now discovered is that the production of those proteins being misfolded occurs by dysbiosis in the gut. It's abnormal bacteria in the gut that will misfold those proteins. And from the area of the lumen of the intestines, they go through the epithelial lining of the gut, not through pathogenic intestinal permeability, but by transcytosis. So you don't need to have a pathogenic intestinal permeability, the slang term, the leaky gut.
Yep.
These misfolded proteins will go right through into the submucosa, and they are attracted into the enteric neurons, the neurons of the nervous system of the gut. They travel up the enteric nerves, neuron by neuron, and they get into the vagus nerve, and they travel up the vagus nerve, neuron by neuron, until they get up to the brain. And I haven't seen any studies that talk about how long it takes, but obviously it takes years for that to occur. And they travel up the vagus nerve to get into the brain, causing that inflammation where the magnetism pulls that protein to a specific area of the brain. So what is it that causes the dysbiosis in the gut that then contributes to the misfolding of these proteins? What is it? Well, it's an inflammatory environment in the gut that will contribute to the dysbiosis. Where does the inflammatory environment of the gut come from? It most often comes from what we eat, that our food selections, whether they're foods that we actually have an immune reaction to or they're just bad foods for us, but it's the environment we create in our gut and the bacteria of the gut that will contribute to if these proteins get misfolded.
Absolutely. You know, we were having dinner towards the end of last year, and I just sort of thought, like, this really isn't a problem for neurologists and psychiatrists in a certain way. Like, this is obviously something that they're dealing with, and I have nothing but empathy for the neurologists who are just looking at MS slides all day, and these people are a long way down the track. I mean, but to actually deal with this, to actually cause a situation where we don't have this amount of inflammatory disease, it seems like it's a different type of health professional that's going to solve this problem.
Here's an example. Here's an example of it. Children with drug-resistant epilepsy. And if you have a child with seizures and they're drug-resistant, that means that you've been to your GP, you've been to the neurologist, you may have been then sent to a pediatric neurologist, the drugs aren't working very well. They have drug-resistant epilepsy. In the American Journal of Gastroenterology in 1996, they published a paper that showed 50% of the children with drug-resistant epilepsy go into complete remission on a gluten-free diet. Wow. 50% of them. But why don't neurologists know this? It's because it's published in a gastroenterology journal. Yep. And neurologists don't read gastroenterology journals, right? So it requires going outside of our area of expertise and embracing a discipline, which is functional medicine, that takes into account the whole body.
Absolutely. So, you know, one of the ideas that we came up with, and this wasn't my idea because you're already doing this, is we basically need an army of coaches, community practitioners, instigators, people who are taking, you know, this message to the people and helping people to change. I mean, sort of autoimmune coaches now with this new thing. What can we do together to make that happen? Because this is 2016. I promised in the emails that we're going to be making some big moves here at the Evolution of Medicine to really take this out. And you're the first person I'm speaking to here. What can we do to make this work?
What you're going to hear tonight from Dr. Cass and Dr. Karazian includes the autoimmunity in the brain, that the inflammation that occurs in the brain triggers an immune process attacking self. And so it's the autoimmune cascade that is an important component of understanding where our patient's symptoms come from. So having an understanding about autoimmunity in a deeper sense than just treating Hashimoto's with Synthroid or treating rheumatoid with anti-inflammatories, having a larger scale understanding. The science is very clear that there is a trilogy in the development of autoimmune diseases, right? You have to have a genetic vulnerability. You can't do anything about that. You have to have an environmental trigger that sets it off, the straw that broke the camel's back. And in many of our talks, it has been to consider gluten, but there are many others also. And you have to have intestinal permeability, or the slang term is the leaky gut. And just read the papers, and you'll see the studies are out there on this. And so what they say in the studies is you can arrest, and that's their words for it, arrest the development of autoimmune disease by healing the gut. So from a functional medicine perspective, that's why I teach about pathogenic intestinal permeability for the Institute for Functional Medicine is that it's a critical component to include in the big picture. So what we want is our practitioners to understand this whole dynamic of autoimmunity and that it's a spectrum. You don't get Hashimoto's the day you're diagnosed. You get Hashimoto's years beforehand, slowly killing off your thyroid tissue, slowly developing it, or lupus, or rheumatoid, or psoriasis. They don't occur in a day or a week. Now we know, and you can identify the early spectrum when they've got elevated antibodies before the tissue damage is so extreme that the symptoms are there. And that's what we want to train our physicians on, is how to identify this spectrum in the development of autoimmunity. And that's what we're going to be teaching about this year.
That's so awesome. Well, for those of you who are watching, just to give you a little hint towards what's happening later this year, we want to help you to develop this army of autoimmune coaches. I think that there's definitely a way that doctors and nurse practitioners and can play a role in functional medicine and will play a big role. But I think these other practitioners, could end up working in a neurologist's office, in a psychiatrist's office, actually implementing the dietary changes, because that's not something necessarily that psychiatrists are trained in either. And if we're constantly trying to train the doctors who don't know anything about it in something new, rather just have a synergy of people working together. And that's exactly the point of the Functional Forum meetup groups. Let's get people in the same room. Let's get them talking. Let's create collisions, as Tony Shea would say. I want to thank you for being here. I know you have to run across to a flight, but Dr. Tom O'Brien is the hardest working man in functional medicine, and I would just say, from all the time that I've known you, I really appreciate your desire to just go out there and make a difference. You can tell that this is in your blood, and you've got the...
Thanks, James. I'd like to say one more thing,
sure,
if I may,
no, absolutely.
and that is we all think as practitioners we need to know how to treat everything that comes in our office. Yeah. We think we have to handle it all. You don't. You find what you really have passion for. And that's what you dial down and you get really good at. And for the rest of it, you bring on a support team. Yeah. And that's a critical component, I think, is that, and I'm going to take the moment here, the opportunity to say this, I believe every healthcare practitioner, every office needs to have a trained registered dietitian or nutritionist on their staff, or they refer to, so that you're not handing patients a sheet of paper to say, here, go eat like this. Yeah. But rather, we're guiding them on how to transition their lifestyle into a healthier lifestyle, because food, as we all know, food is medicine, and it's a primary first component in addressing any type of health condition.
Absolutely. Well, that's part of the plan. It's doctors and coaches working together. You probably could have guessed that plan from everything that we did last year. But 2 weeks tonight, on the 18th of January, we are going to be running a special webinar with Tom and myself, where we're going to be introducing to everyone the opportunity to become an autoimmune coach, a certified gluten practitioner. This army of practitioners that can go out and re-educate the population, work with practitioners, and make it happen. It's going to be a fun year.
James, thanks very much.
It's going to be a lot of cool stuff coming up. Let's have a round of applause, everyone at home, for Dr. Tom O'Brien. Thanks, Tom. All right, let's get on to, we've got a bunch of new speakers here this evening. I just want to mention we're going to have a book of the month club. We haven't done this before, but each month we're going to recommend a book, because what I saw happening, and this is one of the cool things about the Functional Forum meetup groups, is that things happen, innovations happen that we didn't really think about, that end up being something that we see as really valuable. And what we saw different meetups doing, I don't know about you, but I've got probably 50 to 100 books at home, of all kinds of books, health books that I've been sent by all different types of people. So what some practitioners were doing at the Functional Forum meetups was starting basically a lending library. There's a month in between each one. That's enough time to read a book. If you read no other book in the next 4 months between now and our next Functional Forum from Boulder, Colorado on February the 1st, I highly recommend The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible by Charles Eisenstein. That video is, that book is amazing, and I would highly recommend getting on audiobook because you can listen to it at 3 times the speed. It's about 10 hours of audio and can be listened to in about 3 hours at 3 times speed, which is my favorite way to do it. So check out that book. It's really incredible. So again, I want to ask everyone listening at home, please send in your questions via Twitter to #FunctionalForum. In your tweets, we will have Dr. Hylakas, Dr. Karazian, and also Pedram Shoje, Dr. Pedram Shoje later here on the panel. But in the meantime, I want to introduce our first keynote speaker. Now, back exactly 5 years ago, so January 2011, we had just put on our first practice management conference in Santa Monica, California. It was called Integrative Medicine and Social Media, The Future of Medicine is Now. And to try and get some people in, I went to the local meetup group that was done for the west side of LA. And that was run by Dr. Hylakas. And that was actually one of the initiating moments of the Functional Forum. I first thought, well, if they have this in LA, they should definitely have this in New York. And I'm really excited now to introduce someone who's been a big supporter of the Functional Forum. She is a holistic psychiatrist. She's written a number of books. And today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hylakas. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here. I think, James, you've done an about what brought me into this whole area. And I've been around in this field for probably over 20 years doing integrative medicine and psychiatry. And I have classical training. I went to University of Toronto School of Medicine, did my residency at Cedars-Sinai, internship at LA County. I did a rotating internship, so I learned a lot of heavy-duty medicine and have written a number of books. So I come by all of this honestly, and I've just made all my own discoveries, because when I started doing integrative medicine, it was new. Nobody else was doing it. So I was kind of, first of all, a pioneer, but also I really had to forge my own path, because we didn't have a functional forum. We had a few conferences, and I'm very grateful for the leaders, Abram Hoffer, Bill Walsh, Jeff Bland, and those are my mentors, and that's how I got into it. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is, first of all, what I do, how I approach patients as a psychiatrist, why I don't do the standard of care, which is just putting people on meds, to which people become addicted, and it becomes very difficult getting them off the medication. And James asked me tonight to really talk about how to gracefully and safely help people to get off of medication, and then how to actually maintain mental health once they get there. So how did I get here? First of all, I'm a doctor's kid, and I learned from my father the art of medicine. He had his office at home, and I was a little girl, and I answered the door. I'd see him do his practice, and I really got the sense of compassion and caring from him. So that was my first inspiration. Then when I went to County Hospital, I had a bit of a culture shock, because I grew up in Toronto, went to University of Toronto School of Medicine, and it was a very humane place. Then County was a bit of culture shock, and I had to really depend on my roots, where I'd come from, about real caring and compassion, and that brought me into psychiatry. However, with psychiatry, I was doing a more psychoanalytically, psychodynamically oriented psychiatry, and more it was becoming medication oriented. People were on pills, people were on antidepressants, antipsychotics, and it seemed to me that it wasn't really working very well, and there was less and less therapy being done by psychiatrists. And I think right now most psychiatrists are pretty much just prescribing medications. So I was led to really see what was in front of me, which is people on medications with lots of side effects, not such good positive effects, a lot of people wanting to get off the meds. And so I really developed programs based on functional medicine for getting people off of the medications, onto natural therapies, and reclaiming their brain. That's what I do. So let me just go over some statistics. First of all, here's a very interesting study. 3,486 individuals aged 35 to 55, none of them were initially depressed. And in a 5-year follow-up, based on their dietary patterns, the whole food people versus the processed food people had very, very different outcomes. And that is, the processed food people were depressed. They were much more likely to develop depression, and it's really clear to me, I mean, I know this, I see this every day, when you eat properly, when you eat whole foods that are feeding your brain, feeding your gut, feeding your whole body, that's when you have a healthy brain. Otherwise, you have symptoms called depression. Depression is not a condition. Depression and anxiety, and in fact, all the psychiatric issues that people have really are symptoms, or symptoms of something's out of balance. And here's some depression statistics from the CDC. 26% of Americans 18 and older suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in any given year. That's huge. A quarter of Americans have a mental disorder. It's the leading cause of disability in the US and Canada. 11% of Americans 12 and older are taking antidepressant medications. That's over 30 million. And it's increasing exponentially. And the highest group is women. 23% of women age 40 to 59 take an antidepressant, which is the highest of any group. And most of the time, it's a hormonal imbalance which needs to be addressed biochemically, not with medication. So what's the downside? The downside, the drugs are toxic. And in detoxifying them, in the body's processing them, it's using up nutrients. These are nutrients that we need to make our brain work properly. So the crazy thing is that we're giving something that's actually interfering with what it's supposed to be doing. Depleting our B vitamins, depleting zinc, depleting magnesium, depleting everything that we need to make the brain work properly. The reuptake inhibitors, the SSRI, actually accelerate the depletion of neurotransmitters. They don't make us have more serotonin, they make us have less. And what happens too is the medications cause a downregulation of the neurotransmitter receptors by 40 to 60%. Also, these drugs are very addictive, very, very hard to discontinue. And they change the brain. So you have a different brain after you've been on the SSRIs or any of the medications for a while. And so going off the medication is really hard because you're working with a different brain. And so ultimately what could have been a short, time-limited depression or even psychotic episode or an anxiety episode or bipolar episode, what could be time-limited ends up becoming a chronic condition. And the truth is that most episodes really would last only 3 to 6 months if they were left alone or treated minimally, not over-treated. There may be times, I'm not anti-drug, I'm just saying that we need to use the drugs appropriately. So we may be turning short-term suffering into a long-term disability because we're changing the brain. And we know this from outcome studies. And besides, with all the increase of antidepressants, we're still having an increase in the incidence of depression. Well, what conclusion can you draw? Well, first of all, our environment's getting worse, but also it may be actually due to the use or overuse of antidepressant medication. And what we also know this from research that antidepressants are only slightly better than placebos, and they fail in the active placebo trials. So really the whole magic bullet idea of taking a pill for every ill, including specifically for depression or specifically for anxiety, doesn't really fly. Now, for some people, some of the time, they may work. But as the way they're being prescribed now, not so much. And the side effects are terrible. I get these young women, I mean, this is so sad. I'll get women, 18, 20, 25, who've gained an enormous amount of weight being on medication. And they feel terrible about themselves. Now, isn't that depressing? You get impairment of memory, GI disturbance. So just think about this. You actually are creating a leaky gut, which is causing more inflammation of the brain, which is making the condition worse. Headaches, insomnia, birth defects, sexual dysfunction. Can you imagine you're on an antidepressant because you're having problems with your relationship, you're depressed, and you end up with sexual dysfunction, men and women. And then some very, very sad outcomes, and that is suicide and homicide. Very much more common than we are led to believe. And many of these occur during withdrawal. And I've seen people have come to me, they've been sent to me withdrawing from a medication and feeling suicidal. So these are things that really have to be, I think we need to educate psychiatrists and educate physicians. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be addressing so many physicians and other healthcare practitioners about this, because it's extremely important information. These are not just harmless placebos, they're actually pretty dangerous. And the stacking of meds can make it worse. People are on multiple medications, and we don't even know the interactions. And the truth is, you need to be taken off drugs very, very slowly. Otherwise, what happens? Discontinuation syndrome. And with discontinuation syndrome, the person feels worse than they did before they started the medication. They could have symptoms like brain zaps, and then their prescribing physician says, see, I told you, you really need to be on the medication. And the truth is, no, you don't. We can actually take you off with the right supplements, the right treatment, and in fact, specifically for treating brain zaps, which are like electrical shocks in the brain, the essential fatty acids work very, very well. And how do we take people off medication? It really varies case to case, but I'm just going to give you some kind of rules of thumb. For example, with sertraline, Zoloft, you can go from 100 to 50 to 25 to 12.5 every 7 to 14 days, or if that feels like too much and the individual can tell if it's feeling like it's too much of a jump, go down by 10% every 7 to 14 days. And sometimes we need to compound it, and that's okay. Get the liquid and then reduce even by 5%. It took a long time to get into this, quote, addiction to the medication, or tolerance, or whatever you want to call it. But so let's respect the brain, give it some time to go off gradually. The payoff is worth it. The other thing is, if you're on multiple medication, you have to be careful which ones to go off of first. Usually the last one first, or one that's giving you problems first. Benzos, even though they're the longest withdrawal, sometimes it's better to go off those first because the other medications will actually cover the symptoms. They'll take care of the symptoms, because getting off of benzos is very, very difficult. And then what I'm really doing is working with nature, working with the body to produce neurotransmitters naturally. We have the best pharmacy inside of us, and we need to add in the right ingredients. It's like baking a cake. You have to have the right ingredients. If you don't have the right ingredients, you're not going to have the right end product. That being said, 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin, needs to be taken at least a couple of hours away from the SSRI medication to prevent serotonin syndrome. We also have to address issues of methylation. Now, this is a very short address, so I'm just giving you some highlights. But these are all the things to consider when you're helping somebody to withdraw from medication, and also just to go on a natural supplement program, even if they're not going to be on medication, which is kind of the better way to go. I love it when I get somebody brand new who said, I've been told to be on meds, I don't want to be, what do I do? And that's the best. So some of the nutrients, baking this cake called neurotransmitters and called a healthy brain. For example, to make serotonin, we need tryptophan, which comes in the food supply, or we can supply tryptophan as a pill, as a capsule, or downstream it's 5-HTP. And in order to make those transitions from tryptophan to 5-HTP to serotonin, we need cofactors. We need zinc, we need B vitamins, we need magnesium, vitamin B6. And on the other side, we have dopamine going to, there's an error there actually, that it should be tyrosine to L-DOPA, to dopamine, to noradrenaline. And again, we need the cofactors. So tryptophan for serotonin, for the serotonin pathway, tyrosine for the dopamine and noradrenaline pathway. So here are some of the ingredients that I give. These are some of the supplements I give. 5-hydroxytryptophan, B6, tyrosine, B12, B3 or niacin. And Abram Hoffer had developed a very good program for schizophrenia using high doses of niacin very successfully. I use SAMe, which is also a good methyl donor, has adenosylmethionine. Folate and B12, particularly if people have methylation issues, and that's pretty common. I also do genetic testing. The omega-3 fish oils, which I mentioned earlier for brain zaps, but the omega-3 fish oils are so important for comprising the cell membrane, and they're anti-inflammatory, and they have so many functions. They're also good for the heart. Magnesium, manganese, chromium, all of these are needed. We need D vitamin, and even in Southern California, where we have lots of sunshine, my patients need vitamin D. And sometimes genetically, people just don't, the receptor sites for vitamin D are not receptive, so you need to give extra vitamin D. So some people need even 10,000 units daily. Vitamin C, different herbal products, lifestyle factors like exercise, diet, and sleep, which we talk about all the time here on Functional Forum, and light therapy, acupuncture, neurofeedback. I love neurofeedback because you teach the brain to self-regulate. We need probiotics. We need to take care of the gut. And very often we use combination products. I've put some together myself because it's hard for people to be opening up 20 bottles, so it's good to have access to combination products for specific conditions. And I would be remiss not to mention the gut-brain connection. I'm certainly not going to give a whole lecture on that, but 90% of the cells in our body are bacteria. And the truth is that up to 99% of our DNA is actually bacterial. It's not our DNA, it's our bug's DNA. And the vagus nerve is actually the pathway through which the gut, the microbiome, connects to the brain. So we have the central nervous system with the brain and spinal cord and the enteric or autonomic nervous system. So it's a very interesting system. We're getting to know more and more and more about how the gut actually controls the brain. Very, very important. So, a very good article, lead article in Psychology Today, Can Yogurt Cure Depression? Isn't that cool? And it was about a group of women that were given yogurt. And this wasn't even, capsules of probiotic, but they were given yogurt, and it really affected their mood. And what we also know is that different strains of probiotics can actually produce different neurotransmitters and produce different mood effects. For anxiety, we have GABA-producing probiotics. For depression, we have serotonin-producing probiotics, and ones that affect cortisol. So these bugs in us they're our friends, and we actually are learning more and more how to utilize them clinically. Gluten sensitivity, huge. For schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar illness, cognitive problems, we must look at gluten sensitivity. And that's just one of the many sensitivities, and often this cross-sensitivity with dairy as well. So I have people go on an elimination diet. There's also, of course, lab testing that we can do. So that it's extremely important to have patients be compliant about this to at least be willing to go on an elimination diet. So in summary, I just want to say, points to ponder. Depression is not a Prozac deficiency. Anxiety is not a benzodiazepine deficiency. Advice: live, eat, and supplement well. Feed your microbiome, be good to your bugs, and balance your brain. And aging isn't optional, but brain aging can be. So I want to thank you for listening. And I have a gift for all of you. If you go to my website, cassmd.com, you can get a free e-report called Reclaim Your Brain, where I recap a lot of this information. And these are some of the books that I've written. They're also available on my website. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Hyla.
And thank you.
Thanks, big round of applause at home for Dr. Hyla Cass. Really is a great friend of the Functional Forum, and thank you so much for a great presentation. Hyla will be back a little bit later. If you ask questions on Twitter with hashtag Functional Forum, we'll be able to bring you those questions. Thanks so much. Another round of applause for Hyla Cass. All right, we are going to move along here quickly. As I mentioned, let's use the hashtag Functional Forum. Let's get some more questions. We've had some great questions already. Based on what Hyla just said, on the very first Functional Forum, I mentioned a technology tool that I think would be really useful to everyone listening right now. So my friend Jeff Glad, who's also been on the Functional Forum, go to mytavin.com, mytavin.com. This is a free endorsement, Jeff. If you go there, you can put in all the drugs that you've ever been on, and then you can see then the nutrient deficiencies associated with those drugs and the symptoms associated with those nutrient deficiencies. And if you see all the things that Hyla was just sharing there, I think there's a lot that we could use. So that's mytavin.com. Check that out. So I just want to mention a couple of relevant tools for the modern practitioner. Some of the sponsors that we have here at the Functional Forum, they really make this Functional Forum possible, and so we want to share a big thank you to them. Freedom Practice Coaching, if you've been watching the Functional Forum for a long time, you know that they have been a solid supporter of us for a year and a half. They have a new training. I know their training, if you've gone down, they really only had one program that was 3 years and very hands-on. It's an extremely effective program, but it's not in the budget or range for all practitioners. They do have a new program that they're starting in January that is going to be just a weekend training where they're going to teach the Freedom Practice Coaching system. If you want to go back and see Matt's talks on the Functional Forum where they talked about pricing and packaging and how to really create the kind of relationship that takes money off the table and just focuses on you being able to help someone get well. Check out goevomed.com/FPC. Another great sponsor. We're very excited. I was at the A4M conference and had an opportunity to chill in their booth. Really great people. IGBO is the Uber for phlebotomists. So if you're running the kind of panels and tests, functional medicine tests in your office, if you are basically in one of the cities that has a NFL team, there's a little bit more than that, but then if you're in one of those major cities, you can use IGBO. It's a mobile phlebotomist who will come to your house or office, and the best thing is neither the patient nor the doctor has to pay for it, the labs pay for it, but it's a way to take the compliance with your functional labs up from traditionally about 50%. Only about 50% of people do the tests to over 98% with IGBO. Check out goevomed.com/IGBO to find out more about them. We talked about Living Matrix before. Living Matrix is a digitization and visualization of the functional medicine matrix. If you're starting to get into functional medicine and you want to learn how to use the functional medicine matrix, Living Matrix is a great asset for that. And we now have a couple hundred clinics using Living Matrix times 100 patients each. So you see 200 clinics times 100 patients each, 20,000 patients, tracking the outcomes of all the functional interventions you're doing. This is the way that we're going to prove that functional medicine is better for a lot of these chronic diseases. So I'd highly recommend to go to goevomed.com/LM and you can get a demo. And also HealthWave, they've been sponsoring our new videos as well, the Evolution of Medicine video podcast. Go to goevomed.com/healthwave, set up a new account. It's free. And what we're seeing and hearing from practitioners is that in months 2 and 3, where the rubber hits the road and you need patients to be adherent to your protocols, the technology inside HealthWave is really setting that up. And a new sponsor that we're going to announce for the first time today, and you'll be hearing a lot more about them throughout the next 6 months, is Embody 360. And it's so new that they don't even have their website up and ready yet. But I can tell you, if you come and visit us at the Integrated Health Symposium in New York, February 24th to 27th in New York, you will find the Evolution of Medicine Technology Suite, and you will get the first look at Embody 360, which we think is going to be a game-changing technology, bringing together adherence, compliance, making it easy for patients to be successful. So come and check us out. Also, if you use the code EVOMED when you register for IHS, you get 15% off. So there we go. All right, so keep the questions coming in. We've had a lot of good ones. We're going to have a panel here shortly. When I was just starting out in the industry, I heard a lot about a doctor with a fairly unpronounceable name from San Diego that everyone went on and on about. I never heard him lecture actually until last October, when I was fortunate enough to be invited to a thyroid mastermind with Hyla and Dr. Karazian. And I was really blown away that day, and I'm very excited to help him make his debut here at the Functional Forum. So a big round of applause for Dr. Datis Karazian.
Don't you know that you blow my mind, honey?
Okay, so one of the things I want to talk with my presentation tonight is really this concept of functional neurology and how is that different than functional medicine. So in a functional neurology model, what's really critical for us is to do a really detailed neurological exam, find out areas of the brain where things are starting to show signs of early neurodegeneration, and then apply therapies to activate those neurons. In addition, blending that in with the functional medicine matrix and looking for all these variables that actually improve brain function. Now, one of the privileges I've had and still continue to do is I work at Bastyr University, California, and I teach brain dissection. So, when the course begins, we have these cadavers, we take out their brains, and then we look at them. If you take a look at this brain here, you can actually see that the brain is actually degenerating. That when you look at the brain, you see that space between the gyri and sulci opening up. That's a sign of neurodegeneration. And one of the things that we know is that there's an absolute fact that as you age, you are going to neurodegenerate. You may not develop a full-blown neurodegenerative disease, but you are going to neurodegenerate. So when you take a look at this brain, it's not just a specimen. This was a person. And if you take a look at this degenerated brain, you can see that areas in the left frontal cortex, left parietal cortex, right parietal areas are degenerated. So what would that do to a person, right? This person's probably going to have a hard time focusing and concentrating and being on time. They're probably going to have a really hard time with recalling numbers and names. They're going to have a really hard time with directions. They may get more injuries on their left side because they have heavy neglect because of the right parietal lobe that's starting to degenerate. So one of the key things is in functional medicine and in general medicine, we have a problem. We don't look for early signs and symptoms of neurodegeneration. If you're waiting for a patient to get diagnosed with dementia because they can't remember family members, if you're waiting for a person to develop tremor to diagnose Parkinson's, it's too late. So one of the things you want to do as a clinician is you want to be able to identify the earliest signs of neurodegeneration. And one of the earliest symptoms of neurodegeneration is fatigue, and specifically brain-based fatigue. So as a clinician, how do you identify brain-based fatigue? Well, you identify it when people tell you they get tired when they do certain things that require brain activity. They get tired if they drive. They get tired if they read. Those are all signs of brain fatigue. That's different than metabolic fatigue. Metabolic fatigue, you're just tired for no reason, or you're tired all day. But brain-based fatigue, it's based on you use your brain, do some activity, and then you discover some type of fatigue. So we know that when patients walk into a clinical setting, they don't usually come in and say, I have early signs of neurodegeneration. They may say they have aging. They may say they're getting older, or, can't remember things with my age or as time goes on. But what they're really telling you is that they're actually having one of the early symptoms of neurodegeneration. Then as time goes on, people lose their memory and their focus and their concentration and their recall and their mental speed and then their balance and their athletic performance, and then they get a set of symptoms. But we have to identify those things early and then look at different types of intervention. So on this diagram, what I put together here is this clinical window of opportunity for brain degeneration. So in the earliest signs of brain degeneration, when you catch people that are starting to notice that their balance is off, or they can't focus, that they can't concentrate, that their recall and word memory is impaired, that they're having difficulty with maybe hearing noises that they used to if there's scatter noise in the background, those are all signs of early brain degeneration. And as time goes on, they get into a progressed stage. That's when they start to have tremor. That's when they start to have changes in how they walk. That's when they start to have changes in their tone and posture. That is the stage where you miss this opportunity to make the biggest impact on brain function. So one of the things I want to share with you is I want to show you guys a clinical case tonight. I want to show you early signs, clinical examination findings. I want to show you applications. And I want to kind of immerse you into this field of functional neurology where we really engage in, the actual exam itself. Now, in a functional medicine model, what we tend to do is we tend to supplement our way of everything. That it comes to just, what supplement do you need for this? What supplement do you need for that? Everyone goes on anti-inflammatory diet. But when you look at brain function, brain needs stimulation. The brain needs activation. Neurons only connect when the brain is activated. So we know that things like exercise, things like reading, things like being a scholar activate and impact connectivity with your brain. And we also know that when we look at different therapies that we use in alternative medicine, those also have a brain effect as well. So have you ever been in a car and you've listened to music and it didn't sound so great? You go to the gym and then you work out and you get back in your car and play the same song again and now it sounds great? Well, what happened? Well, the exercise you did increased brain activity. It changed your neurotransmitter function, increased blood flow to your brain. So now music sounds wonderful, right? So we know that different types of stimuli, whether it's music or aromatherapy or spinal manipulation or acupuncture, all have this impact on the brain as well. And this is why not everyone responds to the same type of therapy. So if someone, for example, had impairment or lack of activity or decreased frequency of firing in their olfactory medial temporal lobe areas, then maybe aromatherapy could totally change how they function, how they digest food, their mood, right? But for someone else who doesn't have activation there, it may be a totally different story. For someone else who may have, decreased integration of their cerebellum and their balance is off, maybe when they get some type of stretch or muscle spindle Golgi activation, which fires into cerebellar pathways, it not only changes their posture and tone, but it changes their digestion and their function. So one of the things that I really want to talk about is how important it is not just to supplement and use diet and nutrition, but the importance of both active and passive kinetic therapies when you look at brain. Now, the brain is all based on having two types of cells, glial cells and neurons. And what I want to focus on first is neurons. Neurons need three things. They need oxygen, they need glucose, and they need stimulation. And if they have those three things, you have healthy endurance with neurons, and you have ideal brain function. Now, we know that patients that are anemic, patients that have poor circulation, patients that have blood sugar issues, patients that have lack of activity or are significantly inflamed, all have impacts of brain impairment. So one of the things we do in a functional neurology model is we look for anemias, we look for dysglycemias, we look for mechanisms of inflammation, but we also do a very thorough examination trying to look at what areas of the brain aren't firing. Now, what you see in this diagram is on the left a neuron branching over a dead neuron, which will then eventually connect to another neuron. That's called plasticity, right? That's actual plasticity there. A neuron being activated to connect to another neuron. Plasticity cannot be made with a supplement. Plasticity cannot be developed through a dietary change. However, we know that diet and supplements have an impact in the chemical environment that can encourage greater plasticity, but the key factor is that you need activation to those pools of neurons, right? So if your memory is impaired, you have to do exercises to activate the medial temporal lobe. If your balance is impaired, you have to do exercises to activate the vestibular cerebellar system. So here's a diagram or an image to take a look at to kind of illustrate this point. What nutritional supplement will help this patient? So their arms atrophied, they've been in a cast from lack of use, they've lost muscle mass. Is there any supplement you can give this young girl to actually make that muscle come back? No, you can't. There is no supplement. The only thing you can do is to activate that muscle. You have to move it. And the brain also operates that way. Neurons have to develop connections to each other. So you can reduce inflammatory triggers. You can improve nutrients to make the brain function in an ideal metabolic environment. But activation is really critical, and it's only really through activation that neurons develop connectivity to each other, or what's called mitochondrial biogenesis. So you have to activate neuronal pools. Neuronal pools have a proteomic message. The proteomic message helps develop mitochondria, called mitochondrial biogenesis, that changes the integration, endurance, and function of the neuron, and also allows neurons to branch into each other. So this is why it's so critical. Now take a look at this patient. As you can see, she's doing finger to nose. And one of the things you'll see is when she does this, at the very end, she starts to have a little shake when she touches her nose. That's called a termination tremor. Those are one of the things that you see associated with cerebellar types of degeneration. And these are more specific for lateral cerebellar types of degenerative pathways.
Close your eyes.
Now here we are, she's trying to walk, or just stand, and she just closes her eyes, and you can see she can't even stand stable with her eyes closed. She's in a heel-toe position, and she's swaying all over the place. So that's a positive Romberg's test. And here she's trying to walk in a straight line, and you need to have at least 3 steps to be able to walk properly. So this is basically the diagnosis of ataxia. Now, she doesn't have any noticeable neurodegenerative symptoms, but she has neurodegeneration. And this is neurodegeneration in the cerebellar pathways, right? So we can see that her spinal cerebellar, dentatorubral-thalamic, midline cerebellum, Purkinje cell inhibition system pathways all have some degree of impairment, and these are critical, and these are how we see things. Now, if you're at home, you should see if you have ataxia. Stand up and try to walk heel-toe, and see if you can walk 3 steps with your eyes closed. If you can't walk 3 steps with your eye closed, you have ataxia. You have one of the most common areas of neurodegeneration, which is the cerebellum. Now, when we move on here, one of the things that we gave her is we gave her this type of therapy. One of the things we found with their examination was that she was actually having downbeat nystagmus. So she was thinking, her brain was feeling as it was falling backwards. So one of the things we did is we did stimulation with this to make her feel like she was falling forward. And after just 2 minutes of stimulation, we can see she becomes very stable. She can stand, she's not swaying anymore. And then as she does heel-toe activation, trying to walk in a straight line, we see dramatic improvement. She can walk 3 steps with her eyes closed. And this is 2 minutes of therapy. So what if we did that for 2 months? What if we did that for 4 months, right? This is the concept of functional neurology. We're trying to activate presynaptic pools to areas where we see early signs of neurodegeneration to make a change. Now, she's not perfect, but this is 2 minutes of therapy. And the next question we ask in a functional neurology approach is, why? Why does she have cerebellar degeneration, right? Assuming it's not trauma-based. So you can see with patients like hers, usually immune involvement. And take a look at this, significant gluten sensitivity. And when we look at gluten sensitivity, a lot of the research is now showing specifically transglutaminase 6 is associated with sporadic idiopathic ataxia. So let me put it to you in a different way. If you have tried walking in a straight line and you can't do 3 steps with your eyes closed, you have ataxia. Now, if your ataxia is not caused by a known mechanism, like head trauma or stroke or a neurodegenerative disease, that's called idiopathic sporadic. The most common cause of idiopathic sporadic ataxia is gluten sensitivity. And part of the reason why is because gluten sensitivity is associated with cross-reactivity. So if you take a look at this image, you can see the amino acid sequence change of gliadin, and you can see the amino acid sequence change of cerebellar. And you can see that V, P, L all have the identical sequence. So what that means is when people have reactions to gliadin, the antibodies they make have such structural similarity to cerebellar tissue that they can actually attach to it and cause a reaction. So on the bottom slide, you see these wells there, and you can see that when they mix cerebellar antibodies with wells of egg or gluten or cerebellar tissue, you see immune reactivity. Now, recently we submitted a paper. We evaluated 208 purified proteins. We actually discovered 20 new proteins that have cross-reactivity with the cerebellum, besides wheat and eggs. That should be in publication soon. We know that this cross-reactive mechanism is really critical. Now, here's the interesting thing. Many of the foods that cross-reacted with the cerebellum are on autoimmune diets or paleo diets. So what we're learning now in functional neurology is that there are specific molecular mimicry foods that have cross-reactivity with certain sites in the brain. Recently, Dr. Vijdani and I, we published a paper on aquaporin, that antibodies against spinach and tomato and corn can have cross-reactivity with aquaporin receptor sites. So we're realizing that specific food reactivities have specific immune reactions in different areas of the brain. Now take a look at this. We have a person that has systemic autoimmunity, and one of the things that this patient that you saw here has is that they have very high thyroid perioxidase antibodies. They have thyroid autoimmunity. Look at this paper that was published in 2007. Anti-thyroid peroxidase antibodies from patients with Hashimoto's encephalopathy bind to cerebellar astrocytes. What this study shows is that antibodies to the thyroid gland can actually attach to cerebellar tissue and promote an autoimmune reaction. So when we ask the question, why does that person have ataxia? Well, she has transglutaminase 6 autoimmune reactivity. She has gliadin cross-reactivity. She has antibodies from her thyroid attaching to it. And here's very, very interesting too, is when you look at her profile, we can see reactions to fire retardants and BPA and benzene, and these all have cross-molecular structures of benzene rings that can also have impacts on cerebellar target sites. So we know there's many target sites for different areas of the brain, and what I wanted to show with you is just this case of looking at a simple case of ataxia and looking at all these different mechanisms that make an impact on brain function. So here's the bottom line. One of the things that we've lost in the world of functional medicine is the art of the physical exam. We're so used to ordering all these different lab panels, having patients go on tons and tons of supplements, but we don't do an exam. If you want to evaluate the brain, you need to do a detailed neurological examination, physical exam. And then once you identify impairments, whether it's a lazy eye, whether it's gait imbalances, whether it's hyperreflexia, whatever the case is, those identify specific regions of the brain where you have loss of function. In a functional neurology model, we then try to do exercises to activate those areas in order to make neurons connect to each other, and we do a functional medicine workup to look at metabolic factors that have an impact on those. If you have any interest in learning more about those, we've created a program. It's called Functional Neurology Seminars. We will be streaming these courses throughout the world. It starts in February. We also have ability for live attendance in San Diego. We'll have one every 6 weeks, and we also have a Facebook page. Hopefully, we'll get some of you to join us. Thank you so much.
All right. Big round of applause for Dr. Baptiste Grazian. Doc, that was great. We're going to move into the panel set. So you want to take a seat here. We've got Dr. Heide Cass here ready for the panel as well. And joining us for the first time on the Functional Forum is Dr. Pedram Shoje, who you may have heard if you've come through the Functional Forum. Come on in, Pedram. Come and take a seat. Yeah, we've had a record number of questions here on Twitter, so thanks everyone who's watching. Obviously, hitting a high note with the content. Now, how are the other mics looking here, team? Shall I pass my mic over, or are we good? Okay, I'm going to just start with, because we had a question for you, Datis, on your information there. Zach Lyon Nutrition, active on Twitter. Thanks, Zach. He says, is neuroplasticity powerful enough to combat MS and other neurodegeneration? Can it mitigate decline, mitigate cognitive processes?
So the fact is my mic on?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. The fact is that whatever neurons you lose, you lose. Dead neurons don't come back. Okay? There's no Frankenstein event that makes dead neurons come back. Neurons that are dead are forever dead. All you can do is make existing neurons reconnect. So when you're looking at any neurodegenerative disease, whether it's MS as an autoimmune, or Parkinsonism, or Lewy body disease, or alpha-synucleinopathies, whatever the protein disease is, there's this balance of how quickly do you make them connect, develop plasticity, versus how quickly you have loss, right? So what we do in a functional medicine model is we try to reduce loss by looking at methylation and inflammation, all these things, but I don't think we do enough to cause connectivity, right? We don't look at, hey, this person has MS and they have symptoms of a left parietal lesion. Let's do some left parietal types of activities to make those neurons connect. So the big answer is you can only develop more connectivity than you're losing to develop function back.
And some of the ways to do that, it seems like that's not supplements, but lifestyle, some of the things that you mentioned there. What would you say are the sort of the key things? We talked a lot about on the forum how sort of community is a big part of health, and it seems like interaction with other people. Is that a part of it?
Sure. So lifestyle is a really critical part of it, but at the end of the day, you sometimes need to do specific activity for areas of the brain, right?
Okay.
So if you have memory problems, you may want to play the memory matching game, right? Or you want to start to memorize your phone book, right? And try to really actually activate your brain to those areas. So it is region specific. It's not disease specific. It's just a matter of looking at the overall function. So obviously community and lifestyle, all those things make an impact. But when we talk about brain, the brain needs specific stimulation, activation to recover in areas where there's loss.
Awesome. Well, we'll come back to that because we have had a few specific questions on that. I want to introduce Pedram. Pedram, thanks so much for the space. This is your set. You have this book coming out in a month's time about the urban monk. If you were listening to the Evolution of Medicine Summit, you would have heard a little bit about it. But, you know, one thing, when we sent out a survey to practitioners, we asked them, and the biggest thing that came back of what practitioners were looking for was more time. They don't have enough time. Now, have you heard that before from anyone else? And I know that there's some juice in the urban monk about that, and I'd love for you to share that with our community about some of the strategies, because this is for practitioners helping their patients who can't get their act together, and also, you know, for us helping these practitioners to get that time back.
Yeah, absolutely. I would start by saying stop sitting, period, right? You want to capacitate and use your day to stay active, and in doing so, you feel less guilty about not making the gym after you had all the charts stack up, right? And so one of the major pieces in getting time optimized is chunk time. And so staying active throughout the day keeps your blood flowing, but chunk time gets you to do specific chunks of work and then move on, and not check email in between, not do all the million things that we think we can do by the presumption that multitasking even works, right? And so I've been through that. I've been in, you know, hospital-based systems, clinics and all that, and you know, look, if you don't stay efficient and chart as you go, by the end of the day, you are hating your job, you're hating your life, because you're never going to get home in time, and it causes family trouble. So, you know, I guess the long answer to that short question is get really efficient throughout your day. What helped me the best was getting off grains, period.
Yeah.
Right? It's just wind drag. You don't want to slow yourself down throughout your day, and then when you do that, you can be clear when you need to be clear in that chunk time, and just leave when it's time to leave instead of stay there. And I know a lot of us, you know, it affects our family lives. It really impacts our personal lives because the work is so enveloping.
Absolutely. No, absolutely critical. You know, I know you have this book coming out called The Urban Monk, available February 2nd. Make sure to check it out. But I just wanted to ask you, what would a monk say, and you are a monk, so I'll ask you this, what would you say, or you were a monk, what would a monk say about everything that you've heard tonight, the degenerative disease, you know, the lifestyle-induced, neurodegenerative disease, and the state of medicine? What were your thoughts on all of that?
You know, a lot of this ancient wisdom has really come back full circle and hit us in the face, right? It's not about interventions. It's not about expensive solutions once you've broken it. It's not about the body shop. It's about the driving school, right? And so all of these practices that we're talking about on the front end are trying to get us from getting derailed. And yes, there's expensive procedures and interventional stuff, which is where the healthcare system is focused right now. But it is a profoundly different universe when we start looking at our food and we start looking at our air and our activity and all the things that can keep us out of that body shop.
Yeah, that's it. I love that quote. Okay, well, let's go to Twitter. We've had a few questions coming in here. Dr. K, this is from Vikram Khanna. Dr. K, any thoughts on the acupuncture cluster of points they call windows to the sky? They are used widely post-CVS. Have you heard of it?
Well, there's lots of research that shows that acupuncture activates the insular cortex, the parietal cortex, and dampens pain by activating an area called the periaqueductal gray. But as far as the specific points, Pedro, you would know more than I would.
Yeah, I've never seen any studies on the windows of the sky. A lot of them are off the head. They're kind of like more in the thoracic outlet, but I don't know of any specific studies on that. Yeah.
Doc, we've had a few questions about that case study that you shared. What exactly was the 2-minute treatment for the lady with ataxia from cerebellar degeneration?
So one of the things that we found with her is that when we did something called a head shaking test, we had to put on some goggles and shake her head, that she developed something called downbeat nystagmus. And I didn't show the video because it's really hard to pick up a nystagmus unless you're looking at it all the time. But she has downbeat nystagmus. So one of the things we do is her brain thinks that she's falling backwards. that her vestibular system has a sway backwards. And when you put her on a posturography, she has a sway that you can measure that she's falling back. So when we have the red and white strips, it's kind of like looking out of a window of a train. We see things moving. So we've had it go in such a way where her eyes would fly upward, so her brain thinks she's falling forward. So we're trying to rehab the areas of her brain. So the areas of her brain that are falling back or weak, and we have to activate the areas of the brain that pull her forward in order to activate her cerebellum. So optic kinetic activation is that red and white strip. Those are very specific cerebellar type therapies. And that's all found in Lee and Z's textbook of neurology of eye movements. It's just basic neurology.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's super interesting. You know, this is maybe contrary to what you were saying earlier, but and maybe Haile, you can chime in on this too. What is some of your favorite nutrients to stave off Alzheimer's and other brain dysfunction? Haile, you
I
want to
can
start?
address that,
Yeah.
sure. Phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, ginkgo, acetyl-L-carnitine, vinpocetine, huperzine.
All the zines, basically.
Others, right? And they really make a difference. I mean, I've had patients who were having incipient Alzheimer's, and putting them on combination products like this have made an enormous difference. And very good for prevention and actually for some rehabilitation too. You're not going to cure Alzheimer's with nutritional supplements, but they're very, very useful. And I've actually put together combinations like that because people are not going to open, especially if somebody's a caregiver, or someone who's losing it. And I'm saying they may not have frank Alzheimer's, but it's a lot of work to open a lot of bottles. So better to have combination products.
Absolutely.
But with the right amounts, but very important. You don't want fairy dust. You want the right amounts, the research amounts in the formulas.
Good stuff. Tatis, you want to add to that?
Nutrients for dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with Haile. Those are all the key nutrients for the punch. My favorite one is huperzine. There's a lot of good research on huperzine actually changing beta amyloid plaques, which is unbelievable, right? And galantamine is also a phenomenal supplement that's been shown to be very helpful for beta amyloid plaques. And they also both help memory. And both huperzine and galantamine are acetylcholine receptor agonists, so they can mimic the receptor site and bind to it. So even unrelated to dementia, if you just want to improve your memory, your long-term memory, okay, you can take those compounds, huperzine, galactamine. Those are phenomenal support for memory.
Oh, curcumin,
Curcumin.
Sure.
because
Like
it's
that one too.
anti-inflammatory.
Let me just ask you this question, because I wanted to ask, we've got a functional neurologist, holistic psychiatrist, some of the range of skills here. Should psychiatry and neurology be taught separately? Should these be different specialties, or is it time to sort of treat brain-based doctors as one tool? I mean, the future of psychiatry
Love
is start
that
from
question.
scratch.
I love that question because I was thinking when I was thinking about what I wanted to say today. One of the things was I'm very grateful that I went to medical school. My early psychiatry training was really more like a psychotherapist. I learned how to do psychotherapy, but more and more I'm actually going back to my medical school roots, to my medicine roots, to physiology, biochemistry, anatomy, and I do think they should be closer. It's a common board. It's the Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, but they're kept separate. I do think there should be more combination. There could be more emphasis on psychiatry, more emphasis on neurology, but seeing psychiatrists simply be prescribers of medication does not make sense, or neurologists simply watching deterioration and measuring it as you continue to go down the path of MS or ALS or whatever, doesn't make sense anymore with what we know.
Absolutely. Tatis?
Well, I think we need skilled neurologists and skilled psychiatrists for proper diagnosis and workup. Those are critical. But the application is not to improve brain function. That's where I think we're missing it. So at the end of the day, you have to improve brain function. So yes, I think they should be, they should cross-train with each other. But at the end of the day, if someone has unhealthy brain, you should use nutrients, you should use activation, you should use exercise, you should do things to actually improve brain function. For me, I was at a shock once. I was teaching a seminar, and I had lunch with a person who became a friend of mine who was a psychiatrist, and he was saying, I want to ask you a question, but you don't have to answer if you don't want to. And immediately I'm thinking, what is he going to ask, right? Mm-hmm. He goes, I'm listening to your talk, and I'm thinking that maybe some of my psychiatric patients may have like blood sugar issues, and maybe some of them may have like actual thyroid conditions.
What a concept.
And I go, what? And his name is Bill. I go, Bill, like, well, you don't check that? He's like, no, that's for the family physician. I go, why don't you check things? I don't want to offend them. And I remember thinking, going, wow.
Yeah.
So it was this whole disconnect of different systems, right? So psychiatry just being mind and neurology just being neurodegenerative diseases is really it's not an efficient model.
No, it's not. Well, let's talk a little bit more about efficient models, because Pedram, I know you've run interdisciplinary clinics with lots of different practitioners working in them. You know, if you were starting those clinics from scratch today and had to think about how best to provide care for these kind of things, what do you see as the sort of the best structuring of clinicians in a team to be able to deal with these kind of things?
Great question. First, just solid EMR platform where we don't have these types of problems and the practitioners can cross and look at the data and look at the diagnostics. I agree with Datis. Look, the diagnostics are solid. We can really figure out what's going on with the person very well. From there, the quarterbacking of that case has been atrocious in most settings, right? So I would say a functionally trained doctor being in the quarterback position and having an arsenal of the different practitioners around, be it naturopathy and acupuncture and chiropractic and whatever else is needed for the patient population, but having someone who understands their team and how to triage that care based on the diagnoses, and then just doing good old-fashioned rounds and treating each patient with the team. That has, in kind of the early inception of these models that I've worked, been really effective, and we're still pushing around paper. Now with EMR, with some of the innovations, and take-home kits, like you could create a video kit for pretty much anything and have your patients basically have a subscription to a lifestyle and wellness channel that you as a physician produce, so that you can follow them home with one time of work in front of cameras and lights and all that, but then you have that kind of follow through and that education that has been lacking, and the hand-holding. And again, that's where nutritionists can come in, a lot of different practitioners to be there to deploy and then report back if something's flagged and we need to track them better.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a key point that you're making. You know, if you've been watching our stuff for a while, the time that you saw Pedram before was we were talking about corporate wellness, and it just seems to me that on this edge of neurology and autoimmunity, there's a massive payer issue here, right? Because these are obviously the most expensive things, and autoimmunity, if you think that autoimmunity is playing a role in, the genesis of all of these, what about, how can we, how can businesses run a more efficient ship? Because I'm sure that these patients are costing the majority of the money, no matter who's paying.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge with privacy. I know a lot of CEOs that have come to me saying, I want to do genetic testing, and then they get pushback. On the flip side, I've had companies bring us in and say, we really need to figure out how to help our population. 2 weeks into surveying them, the obvious answer is you're stressing them out. So how do we rectify this? You got to throttle back on how you're driving this workforce, and so it becomes a political issue and a privacy issue mostly. If the C-level is into it, I've had lots of C-level executives come in, get a full battery of tests. You know where the icebergs are. You know how to navigate. And you do the things that Datis and Heil have been talking about, is really figure out how to not get the neurodegenerative disease, not fall into these problems, right? But I got to say, in corporate, it's politics, and so each individual case is different.
Yeah, to come to your point there, Datis, you had that graph of sort of the sloping curve. What are some of the things that primary care, nutritionists, everyone who's listening, every provider can look at as those early signs so that they can catch it before they get too late?
Well, I would say start with yourself. Has your handwriting changed? Has your handwriting gotten worse? How's your memory? How's your recall? How's your endurance for cognitive activities like reading and driving? If those are going downhill, you're neurodegenerating. It's just that simple. So all the things we talk about in functional medicine, whether it's leaky gut or dysglycemia or prostaglandin imbalances or hormone deficiencies, whatever they are, they all have an effect on a tissue that has no more cell division, the brain. So the brain has no more mitogenic cell division anymore. So whatever neurons you get are the ones you're born with. Now, over time, they connect to each other to allow you to have function. But if you're noticing those things come down, it's not aging, it's loss of brain activity, right? So we have this tendency to think, oh, we're just getting older. But it's not getting older, it's actually neurodegeneration. Now, in your patient population, if they can't find your office in time, because they get lost, right?
Yeah.
Someone has to drive them to the office. They forget their office forms. It takes them forever to do your office forms because they're neurodegenerated, right? You look at their forms, their handwriting is off. You see them walk and they're not walking with proper gait, right? You do a history and they can't remember. They fatigue in your history. Those are all signs of neurodegeneration, and the patient is never going to come in and tell you they have early signs of neurodegeneration. So you as the clinician have to pick those up.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's some great questions there that any practitioner could ask, like, how things have changed over time. How do you do things like that with patients? How do you, people are coming to you mainly with already, far down the line for kind of issues. How do you sort of, how do you set up hope in that sort of situation where typically hope has come from a pill?
I do a full workup. I mean, I do what the family doctor should be doing. I do basic lab tests. I look at thyroid, adrenals. I look for anemia, vitamin deficiency, some really basic things, and start from there. It's not just throwing vitamins at them.
Dr. K, we had one more question here. Lots of great questions on Twitter tonight. Thank you for everyone who's participating on Twitter. If you determine someone has gluten sensitivity, how long before noticing a positive change in brain function?
It all depends on the extent of the injury. Okay. So gluten sensitivity is one thing, but gluten sensitivity that turns into neuroautoimmunity is something else. Gluten antibodies are different than if it's transglutaminase 6 versus actual gliadin, where now they have gliadin with cross-reactive cerebellar issue or gliadin sensitivity with myelin basic protein. Not to complicating it, but it is not that simple, right? So we published a paper 2 years ago where we looked at 400 healthy blood donors, and we looked at antibodies to wheat and gluten, and we looked to see how many of them had neurological antibodies. So we found was approximately 15% of the healthy population have antibodies to milk or wheat. Wow. Of those, half of them have antibodies to myelin or cerebellum. And the ones that had antibodies to casein, alpha-beta casein, and milk butyrophilin had very high myelin antibodies, and the ones that had gluten antibodies, many of them had cerebellar antibodies. So if you have gluten sensitivity and you have cerebellar autoimmunity developed from it or myelin autoimmunity developed for it, you may not even have MS, noticeable symptoms yet, but your recovery rate is going to be totally different than someone just has gluten sensitivity and they have a little bit of brain inflammation, right? So it depends on the extent of the reaction.
And Pedram, last question here because we're going to wrap up. From the Urban Monk book, what is the tip for doctors who are listening and also for patients who they're going to work with on simple things that they can bring into their life to aid with the kind of things that Tatis was talking about here?
I would have to say one of the most important pieces in our understanding of how to take care of ourselves is that a lot of the mind-body practices that have come over from Asia have really been ascetic practices. And here, as householders, busy people, we're trying to practice things that we don't have time for. So I'm so guilty I didn't make it to yoga. I don't ever get time to meditate. I don't have time to meditate an hour a day. I'm sure neither of you do, right? But I can take 5 minutes in between calls. I can stop when I'm in an elevator and not check my phone and just check in and stop. And I think that there's, it's almost like flossing your teeth. There's a mental hygiene that needs to be built back in culturally because we've accepted these excessive amounts of stress as normal, and we just keep taking it on. So learning to layer that on and teach our patients how to do just some basic mental hygiene and de-stress wherever they can in the little minutes that they have here and there has proven to be very effective for our patient populations, and it's just common sense. We're heading in the wrong direction with stress.
I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, but you said you need to curate an education program for patients, and that education program probably should be something repeatable, like an online. We've talked about that, and we will have some resources coming later in the year, sooner rather than later, actually, of people who have created those sort of assets to make it easy for you. But it seems like, recommending or prescribing the Urban Monk book might be a good step.
Yeah, please do. I'd love it. You know, it's one of those things where if you can't prescribe, like I can't follow someone to teach them meditation, right? Yeah. But I can hand them meditations when they come in and say, here's your welcome kit to our practice. And it has some recipes, it has some stretching, some basic functional movement, here's some meditations, and here's all the things that I would teach my son so that he can stay well in this world, right? And so what kind of care kit can we create for our patients so that we can take these lifestyle practices home? That's how I'd like doctors to start thinking, because we can't follow them around. But what's happening is the lifestyle that they're coming in with is overwhelming our interventions that we could help them with. And so we have to find better ways to follow them home.
Absolutely. And talking about scale, I really feel like, there's a limited number of doctors that can pick apart the complexity, right, of tough cases. Scaling that number is going to be difficult because they have to come through the kind of training you're providing. But I think we can scale this part of what you're talking about. We're talking about we can scale the autoimmune coaches, what Tom O'Brien was talking here at the moment. There are people out there that are hungry. They've been through these kind of issues. They've had gut issues. They've healed them. They're coming out the other side saying, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. Like, what can I do? I think there's a real opportunity for those people to be engaged into the health system in a new way and support these kind of providers. I look at someone like Frank Lipman's practice with, one doctor and 7 health coaches, where he's able to really scale his impact, take less time with patients, but still have a really great sessions with them by the fact that the coach is doing the majority of the work. So we've got a lot of work in front of us, but I really appreciate all 3 of you and Tom O'Brien for coming in and sharing your wisdom. We really have an amazing group of physicians leading this charge toward more evolved medicine, and it's been very great to have you here all on the Functional Forum, making your debut as well. So this is about it from Orange County, California. Next month, we are going to be coming to you from Boulder, Colorado. It's been a bit weird not having a full studio audience. We've never done that before for the Functional Forum, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Big shout out to all the meetup groups that are here and as far flung as the Philippines and South Africa, Kima Wellness in New York. We still have a meetup in New York, even though we're doing the Functional Forum from here. The next date is February 1st. It's called Gut Health, the Root of Evolved Medicine. We've got Jill Carnahan. We've got Sayaji from Green Med Info. We've got Steve Wright. We've got Isabella Wentz. We've got Mark David from the Institute of Psychology of Eating. If you want to come out and go skiing the weekend before and come to the Functional Forum, there are still tickets available. But it's been my great pleasure. I'm your host, James Maskell. This has been the Functional Forum, and we'll see you next time.